You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I'm Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, and today we have coming up for you a Hebrew reading of Malachi 1:12, a Hebrew vocabulary episode. We're going to change things up a little bit starting today with that. And then we have an episode of Christ and Classics coming up, all in this, or a segment of Christ and Classics coming up, all in this episode. So Hebrew reading of Malachi, Hebrew vocabulary, and then Christ and Classics. So make sure you watch through for all three. Now, we're going to do two new things, as I said, with the Hebrew vocabulary, and I guess I'll go ahead and tell you what those are. So we've been doing I've been just working through a vocabulary list for a long time by frequency, but I'm going to do this a little bit different because I think it may help in the long run. When we do the Hebrew reading, we're just going to pick a word from the Hebrew reading that we're doing and emphasize that as our Hebrew vocabulary term for the week. All right, so we'll see which term we pick up here in just a moment, but that's what we're going to do. All right, so let's get on with this. If you're watching, I'm going to open up stepbible.org, and we're going to look at Malachi 1:12. If you're just listening, that's fine too. As always, I encourage you to read aloud or speak aloud, whether that's reading along with me, repeating after me, reading when I'm done, whatever. Just make sure you're getting those speaking reps in. All right, so I'm going to share my screen here of stepbible.org, and we're going to get on with the reading. So we're at Malachi 1:12, and this is a cold reading. I haven't looked at this yet. So here we go. V'atem mahalalim auto b'amarkem shulchan Adonai migal huwa v'nivo niveze akalu. So I had a couple words I tripped over there. That's all right. Let's go again. Va'atim halalim auto b'amarkem shulchan Adonai megal huwa v'nivo niveze akalo. All right. One more time, and then we'll do it with the Nikodem and Dagashim off. So v'atem halalim. I think I was just doing halalim there. So halalim auto. All right. So this is interesting when you have the aleph followed by the vav with the cholim vav. So you could do something like a-o-to, or more like an auto, and it sounds like alto, or auto, that's kind of how I do it, auto, and then we have amarkem shulchan Adonai Gaal. Now, I wasn't saying it that way. Magal is another way you could do this. But since we have the aleph and the comments, you can do Magal, or actually it would be Magoal. There we go. Magoal Hua. So Adonai Magoal Hua. The Nivo Niveze Akalo. All right, let's turn the pointings off and see what we get here. All right, Malachi 1:12. Let's find it. And there we go, Malachi 1:12. So we have V'atim mechalalim aoto ba'amarkem shulchan Adonai megoal hua v'nivo, niveze, akalo. Not too shabby. V'atem mechalalim אותו באמרכם שולחן אדוני מגואל הוה v'nivo, niveze, akalo. All right, one more time with the pointings on. All right, back down to Malachi 1:12. Again, I would highly encourage practice reading with the dots and without them. It's good to have a skill for both. So, v'atem mechalalim auto ba'amarkim shulchan Adonai megoal hua v'nivo niveze akalo. So, v'nivo niveze akalo. So you got a lot of O sounds here. So Adonai megoal hua v'nivo niveze akalo. Yeah, so interesting. And then the aoto up here. V'atem mechalalim aoto ba'amarchem shulchan Adonai megoal hua v'nivo niveze akolo. Yeah, so that's my reading in Hebrew of Malachi 1:12. Yours may be better. Hopefully it is better. Let's pick up the word here, shulchan. Now, that was our Hebrew reading. Let's move into our Hebrew vocabulary. And our word is this time shulchan, which means table. Shulchan. Shulchan. It's got that guttural sound, shulchan. Shulchan. I don't know if I have a mnemonic device right off the top of my head for this shulchan. 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 Shul, like shiel. Shulchan. 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 Yeah, I don't think I have a mnemonic device for this. Here we go. So if you're sitting next to someone, like a woman, she's to the right of you, or she's across from you, and you're thinking, oh, I'd like to get the salad, you think, oh, if I ask her, she'll hand it to me. So she'll hand, sounds a little bit like shulchan. She'll hand it across the table. Silly mnemonic device, but there you go. She'll hand it to me. Shulchan. She'll hand it across the table to me. Silly, but it works. Shulchan. You can come up with your own if you don't like that one. Take it or leave it. Shulchan. So there's Malachi 1:12 in Hebrew, and then our Hebrew vocabulary term this week, shulchan. So shulchan Adonai. What do we have? A table of the Lord or something like that? Shulchan. Shulchan. And yeah, so all right. Hang out here because we have a Christ in Classics episode coming up that you're not going to want to miss. All right, I'm going to stop there and say I hope that helps. But again, hang out because here we go. We got Christ in Classics coming up. All right.
Welcome to another episode of the Christ in Classics podcast. I'm here with one of my best friends, Ben House, pastor, educator, author, church member, friend, scholar, Ben House. Go ahead. What were you going to say? You're going to say something?
Not yet.
Not yet? Oh, okay. I was just telling Ben how I'm super awkward with these beginnings. And so my tendency is just to jump straight in and ignore some of the introductory remarks. But I guess one of the big things that's on my mind that I guess Devin and I haven't announced yet is that Ben and I just finished a manuscript of a book that's going to be published by Glossa House. And shortly it'll be coming out pretty soon. I gotta give Ben credit for 75% of 85% of everything on that book.
88%.
Yeah, he basically wrote the book decades ago, or over a decade ago.
Just about it, I think.
Yeah, and I took it and cut a lot of stuff, rewrote a lot of stuff, added a chapter, and we'll see how it goes. What's it called, Ben?
Beyond the Horizon. I think the subtitle is something like a guide for parents on classical Christian education.
Beyond the Horizon, an appeal to parents
An appeal, okay.
for classical Christian education.
Obviously, I didn't write the title.
Yes, it's written with those parents who either don't know much about classical Christian education, don't know anything about classical Christian education, or, in my opinion, also, who are opposed to the strange thing of classical Christian education. Hence the subtitle, An Appeal to Parents.
And for those who need a really serious scholarly look at this, something that's going to provide all of the data, all of the current trends, an in-depth look, skip our book. Ours is just a fun approach to education, and it's going to leave parents like classical Christian education always leaves them wishing that they had gotten this kind of education.
Yeah. It'll change everything, I think. So, Devin and I are about to begin a short little stint, a few months worth, in some historic American documents, beginning with the Declaration of Independence, which we'll record beginning next week. And so I thought it would be helpful for me and perhaps for our faithful 20, what we call them, our faithful 20 listeners that we have each episode, to get some kind of historical background to the Declaration of Independence and the Republic in general. I was an awful student in high school and in middle school, and so I have lots of knowledge gaps about the particulars of history throughout the ages. I'm slowly beginning to fill those up, but the questions that I'm going to ask you, Ben, I'm hoping you can really answer for me. Ben prides himself with being able to teach American history in his sleep, and I believe him. And so, as a way to prepare us for the Declaration, let's start with America. But even before that, let's start with Britain. But I thought, as I was driving over here, I was thinking it even goes before that, because he goes back to Spain with Columbus, right?
Well, that's every historical event always is hinging on something that went on before, and that's the problem with history is that you end up always needing to get back to Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. But there's usually not time for that, so we have to say, okay, here's where we're going to start this, recognizing nothing ever just burst into this world entirely new and in full bloom. It's always built upon all kinds of factors that have gone before.
Okay. So let's just start with Britain then. So we all know, we've known from grade school years that men and women from Great Britain and England were fed up with so-called religious oppression. They left to form the colonies in what we now know as New England. Why did that take place? And could you provide some detail along the way?
Well, there's an old saying that, like a lot of little handy sayings in history, it's useful and it's also, far more complicated, but let's just go with the useful, and that is God, gold, and glory. And so when people came to the colonies, a lot of them were interested in the religious freedom, with that being a motivation, because what you have going on in England is a long-term fight going back to the time of Henry VIII, whenever he breaks from the Catholic Church, and you end up with, in time, the Elizabethan Compromise, which a compromise means everybody's still unhappy, but we might not be killing each other over it at the moment. So you still had people who were dedicated Catholics who were unhappy. You had people who were of a very strong Protestant feeling, the ones that we come to call Puritans, who were unhappy And you had some people in the middle who said, well, yeah, this Anglicanism works. But a lot of those people who were unhappy found, particularly initially the Protestant ones, found an outlet here in the colonies. And so the original little group that heads off to Plymouth Rock were made up of people that, we commonly call them the Pilgrims, but they were separatists. And they wanted to separate from the Church of England. There were just a few of them. They get overwhelmed by the Puritans who come in within a few years into Massachusetts. And the Puritans, separatists separate from the Church of England. Puritans purify the Church of England. But once you put 3,000 miles between the Church of England and the colonies, all the people there were really more in the separatist camp. So it becomes an area where let's try this becomes a way of being able to function. So, you get in trouble for it in England. Some people left England to go to the Netherlands because in the Netherlands, the view was, hey, as long as you're a Christian, do it however you feel. But you don't want to live in the Netherlands because you're not Dutch. So here was the chance to be English and have your own way of doing things, church experiments. Now, at the same time, because they were used to situations where they were outvoted or they were suppressed or they were not allowed to do what they wanted to do, they didn't come here with just a free open market, do whatever you wish. It was like, in Massachusetts, here's how we're going to do it. And if you have some views that are way off the mark, you better get out of Massachusetts. Now, there are other options. The Catholic people that were looking for a refuge came to Maryland. People who held other...
Hence Maryland.
Yes, named after not Queen Mary, but the wife of James. I think James the First. Anyhow, you had all kinds of experiments going on in the colonies that were motivated by the God part of the three things, but there was also the gold part. As I would teach my kids, 1607, settlement at Jamestown, no gold found. But that's what they were looking for. And it turned out that they found something that was just as good as gold.
As lucrative.
Yes, as lucrative.
Let me guess.
And that was, guess.
Tobacco.
Yes. Yes, I remember being in a restroom at a museum for Thomas Jefferson, and there was a sign up in there of it said no smoking, and somebody wrote under it, but Jefferson raised tobacco, and it was just kind of ironic because tobacco turned out to be just an incredible craze, and people made all kinds of money off of that. And so that took, and of course, there'll be other crops that people start finding. The gold wasn't here. The gold that was in South America. But they find ways to make money. That motivates a lot of them. But the people who were coming to Virginia were quite often in their own, what we might say, personal prayer lives. They were quite often as Puritan as the Puritans. It's just that, it's just like two guys go to college. One goes and he majors in theology, and the other goes and majors in business. But both of them are dedicated Christians. And so Puritan Virginia had rules against Sabbath breaking, rules against blasphemy, rules of all kinds of Christian morality that was encased or encoded in the rules. So you had a religious motivation there. And so again, just various ways you could work this out on your theology. The Quakers came; they got in trouble too. They were, you could say, a radical form of Puritan Protestants. They went off the grid on many ways because of their lack of commitment to Scripture, and they got in trouble. They come to Pennsylvania. They have a very open system. Anybody can come here. Now, again, kind of the oversimplified view. In Pennsylvania, they ran into problems with the Indian tribes there and conflicts, and Quakers were pacifists. they generally tried to get along with the Native Americans there. But they didn't always do that. But they couldn't fight them. But guess what? North of England, you have Scotland. And there you have a religious conflict going on with the Scots against their government. And some of the Scots had migrated over to Northern Ireland, hence the term Scots-Irish. And they come over. And they're looking for a place. And the Pennsylvania frontier was open to them. And it just made everyone happy because the Quakers had more settlers coming in here. The Scottish Presbyterians moved out to the frontier. They didn't have a problem with fighting. They loved it. It was just, a part of their genetic code, we could almost think. So they began their practices of Presbyterianism, and the movement of Presbyterians was unlike some movements where it went from east to west. Theirs went from more like northeast to southwest. So as they moved down the Appalachians, covering the frontier areas. But again, people highly motivated by the God part of the whole equation.
And so at this point in time, who's in control? Who's organizing these people? What's the government of these colonies look like?
Okay, what goes on is that technically the whole thing belongs to the king. And so that's why, whenever someone would arrive, the first thing you do is you bow down and you give thanks to God and you claim this land. And I mean, it's like, from right here to wherever this ends. If they would have had a modern day map, they would have said, well, all the way to what we'd call California. Like, I'm claiming this in the name of King James, or before that, Queen Elizabeth. And later, just whoever is the king. So it belongs to the king. The king could grant charters. In some cases, like one of the kings had a favor he owed to William Penn. He granted an area to Penn. Penn's woods, Pennsylvania.
And Silva in Latin is woods.
Exactly.
So Pennsylvania.
And in other cases, it was to the Jamestown or the Virginia Company. They're the ones who got Virginia. And so the king is king over that area. As far as local government, that slowly develops in New England, more of a city local government. The town halls and things like that developed out of New England. But in the southern colonies, you'll have the development of the House of Burgesses, where you have representatives that come together. And just across the colonies, these things just, as the colony gets bigger, people would realize, like, okay, we've got to have some way of governing this colony. What are our rules going to be? What are our boundaries? How do we manage this? Who controls the troops? Who controls, any kind of civic affairs? And so you had these governments that were then modeled after the representative governments in England. So they were like versions microcosms of Parliament, usually with a lower house and then an upper house that would be made up of a committee and a governor who once again would have been appointed by the king and Parliament. So and that's why you're going to end up with a lot of conflicts over governors, because the people aren't choosing the governors, and the governors are not answering to the people, but answering to the king. So that's how it all gets rolling. So you have not really 13, but really far more than that, because you've got colonies that in time will be all the way up into Canada. You've got colonies down in the Caribbean. You have places like the Carolina colony that where the people in the northern part were irritated at the people in the southern part who were more wealthy, and they broke away, separating two colonies. You had people between New Hampshire and New York that had their own little, we're going to do it our way, Vermont colony. You had a colony down in to the west, Florida, what is now the panhandle of Florida and part of southern Alabama and Georgia. and colonies, like I say, down in the Caribbean. So you probably had anywhere from 27 to 40 different colonies.
So
Each one like plants in a garden,
yeah,
growing at a different stage, microcosms, pictures, images of what you have going on in England, with all of them being under the same king.
yes, yes. Aside from the other immigrants coming in from, say, the Netherlands and Scotland.
Scotland, Germany,
Yes.
a few from France.
And so, assuming all that's happening, assuming that we have, like, or recognizing that we have multiple ethnicities coming from multiple countries, the big one being England, and those from England coming over because of their dissatisfaction, generally speaking, with Parliament, government, Church of England. They come over to this new land, begin to settle it over the course of 100 so years,
Mm-hmm.
but still maintain the form of government for which they're dissatisfied in England. Is that because that's just the only form of government that they've known? I'm trying to put the pieces together that connects their dissatisfaction with England and the steps that it takes them to begin to finally break away from England and establish their own different form of government.
When it reaches a point of dissatisfaction, it's not with England.
What year? What time frame, roughly?
Well, probably the 1760s.
Okay.
Yes.
That late?
It's really, there will be conflicts along the way, but it was just like, it's just like a kid at age 12 who has a conflict with his parents. At that point, unless he is just really bad, he's not going to move out of the home.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when he gets 17 or 18 and he's still living there for whatever reason, then moving out is an option. And so early on in the colonies, there was not a lot that would have united the colonies to each other. So if you look at something like New Hampshire and Georgia, geographically, they were a long ways from each other. The reasons why they were settled were very different. The climates were different. Someone living in the Georgia colony would not have felt any kind of a bond of solidarity with someone living in New Hampshire. And so it wouldn't have been thought of. It would only be later when colonies started getting a sense of, hey, we're all in this fight together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the dissatisfaction is going to come with them being upset. They direct it against the king, but really a lot of the dissatisfaction is against Parliament on the grounds that Parliament is making rules for us and they don't have any jurisdiction over us. And I would always tell my kids, it would be as if the state, here we are in Arkansas, if the state of Kansas passed a law that we in Arkansas are supposed to follow. It might be a good law. It might be a sales tax that would be lower than our sales tax, but we would object to it if we were like the colonists on the grounds that it doesn't matter whether it's good or not. We're not under your jurisdiction. And so that will be the developing argument of the colonies, that we have our jurisdiction. We're under the same king, but we're not under Parliament.
So at this point in time, 1760s, are there British troops in the colonies keeping watch, guarding, doing their duties?
Well, when you say the 1760s, the big event there, which is going to be, when you look at causes of the American War for Independence, like this is the big event. This is the match going to the, it's going to blow the whole thing up, and it's the French and Indian War, which is 17. All of a sudden, my date is just lost. 1757 or 1754 up to 17. Yeah, 1754 up to 1763.
Okay.
And that will, perhaps more than anything else, bring a lot of these issues to a head because, yes, there were British troops there, and they were protecting us, the colonies, from, on the one hand, Indians to the west, but mainly French to the north, Spanish to the south. And at the end of
Yes.
that war, the French were removed. And so the question comes up of why now do we have these troops ruling over us? And Britain's view was, why now are you not paying for these troops that are there protecting you? And, from the British viewpoint, it was like, you want us to protect you, but you don't want to pay for it. And from the American viewpoint, it was, well, you've got, you Brits have this land out there and you have interest to protect, and it's not our job to then pay your taxes, and we're not under that jurisdiction.
Yep. Yeah.
So, the British, you can make a case for the British in this whole deal.
Mm-hmm. So the French are eliminated, generally speaking, as a
Yes.
threat from the north. You still have the Spanish in the south, which will come to a head, I guess, later on with Texas, right?
Well, that's Mexico. So
Oh, yeah.
that-
Yeah. That's right.
Spanish or not, that's not really an issue.
Yep. And so, French and Indian War. Is there anything else? Any other major event? I can think of a couple, but are there any other major events that really lead to the formulation of and the ratification of? Well, actually, that leads to the formal beginning of the Revolutionary War.
A good case can be made that in the 1740s, the Great Awakening really had a big impact on the mindset of America. And it's more, this is Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, the Tenets, and others who are preaching the new birth and what was a more in-your-face, radical kind of Protestant Christian experience. It broke down the barriers of a lot of the state churches. It created more of a sense of the individual and of individuals forming churches and being independent. And so that is a strong catalyst. We could say it weakened the older Puritan establishment in the north. It weakened the Anglican establishment in the south. It created more of an Americanized Christianity. So that all is a factor. You have, along with that, a continual concern that at some point Britain will start appointing bishops over America. I mean, like the appointment of bishops was a big deal. So, and particularly if you've
Catholic bishops?
No,
Or
Anglican.
Church of England.
Church of England.
That's right.
So if your parents or your grandparents had been Church of England, a bishop appointed to the American colonies would not have been an issue. But a lot of the people in the Awakening became Presbyterian, became Baptist. A little bit later, Methodist will start cropping up, and there are various groups who will have the view of, we do not want a one government religion or denomination imposed upon us. And that's what's going to later lead to the First Amendment about Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. It was not that Congress was somehow or another to be anti-Christian. It was just not supposed to make America a particular denomination. So you have that. I think one of the main things is just that it's just coming of age. So by the time you get to the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s, you've got these colonies that have been around for, in most cases, well over 100 years or so. They have cities. The colonies have 2 million people. Britain has 4 million. Yeah, a lot more, but 2 million's not bad. They have established towns. They have universities. They have trade established. They have, they're functioning like a country. Once again, to use the analogy of the kid who reaches his, 17 or 18, if he gets 17 or 18 and he has bought a car and he's paying insurance on it and he's working and all that, for him to be talking about moving out and being independent is not anything radical. There's just a natural point of break there. Add to that, there's 3,000 miles here between England and the colonies. And the colonies have a view like, hey, we've been doing this on our own for a long time. So when laws start coming along after the French and Indian War, things like the Stamp Act, things like, just whatever other kind of the Tea Act finally, and some of these other things that are imposing these taxes, again, it's not as though, like, oh my goodness, how we're ever going to pay those taxes. Like, we're not going to pay them in principle. Yep. Because you don't have a right to be taxing us over these things. And it was a growing sense of independence. How strong was that sense? When the war starts, George Washington and his officers are still drinking toast to King George III. By the time a year or so later, when we get to the Declaration of Independence, usually we hear things like 1/3 of the people in the colonies were for independence. So, a large portion of that, and nobody, I mean, like there weren't, accurate polls, but, we're not talking about everyone.
What were the reasons for not separating by people or politicians or otherwise?
Because if you are an English colony, you were living in the best government of the world at that time. If the 13 colonies had been under the Russian Tsar, it would have been assuming that he could have somehow or another had control over them. It would have been terrible. The French colonies were not as nearly as free. They had a whole different system. The Spanish colonies were not as free. So it's like, all right, we're living in the best government, under the best government in the world. And a lot of people, there's always, at the heart of a Marxist view of history is like, all things boil down to economic. And one of the reasons why Marx appeals to so many people is he's almost right. And he is right a lot of the time. So for a lot of people, economically, it would not have made sense to break with England. Mm-hmm. They were tied to it. So if you were Anglican clergy, or tied to the Church of England, or if you still had family connections there, there would be a good reason to stay. Plus, just the fact that we like staying with what it is that we've been comfortable with, we've been a part of. Why are we breaking away from this? So, a lot of people really went through a mental struggle to get from that point of, we have some grievances that we want addressed, to reaching that point of saying, forget addressing these grievances, we want independence.
If we back up 100 or so years, a little before, from mid 18th century, when, what was it? How many ships sailed? Nina, the Pinta, Santa Maria, and the Mayflower? Is that right?
Well, the first three were the Columbus ships. Then
there we go.
That's a whole different story.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. The Mayflower is the one that comes to.
Is it just one?
Yeah. Well, that's the Mayflower.
The main one.
And the Speedwell headed off to Virginia.
Yes.
Ended up at Plymouth Rock.
Yes.
Speedwell didn't make it. Didn't Speedwell?
Right. Oh.
How
did that go? Don't do that to me. Are we still going? Oh, I'll just edit that out.
Okay.
Anyways.
All right. Then the Arabella is one of the few that came to the Jamestown colonies. I don't remember the others.
Okay. So my question that I've had since the very beginning of all this is, obviously the ship sailed, so they had some sort of permission, they had some sort of resources to get ships and also to load the ships up for however long it took them to get across the Atlantic, and to have enough resources to begin living somewhere. Mm-hmm. Did Parliament have any indication that this could be fiscally advantageous for them, or was it just a sayonara suckers kind of, you guys want to separate, see how well it goes for you? Like, did they think that this whole project would be advantageous for them?
The philosophy was called mercantilism. Mm-hmm. And which is, just one of those, okay, kids, get ready to take a nap. I'm going to lecture on mercantilism now. Economic policy of the colonies. But it really boiled down to, it's the same kind of thing that would happen when Sam Walton decided, let's set up these stores across the United States.
Oh.
And side note, but his philosophy was, let's hit all the small towns and set up the stores there. It was ages before they moved into the big cities. So, but it was a risk. You didn't know whether this was going to work or not. But the idea was that the colony will make money for the mother country. And it'll make money in these ways. It'll give us a place to sell things, and whatever products they have there, it will give us a chance to buy that product. Yeah. So this is going to be, here come these goods we need. Here's a place, we can suddenly double and triple the amount of textiles we're making because now we have a growing market for them there. And since it's our colony, it's not helping the French or the Spanish or the Dutch. It's helping us. It's for us. It's FOBU, for us, by us.
Yes. Oh.
So, see, I'm making all kinds of references here to all kinds of things. So they were called joint stock companies, and it was a case of you may lose everything. One of the first colonies was in Roanoke. They set up the colony there. The guy that was in charge of it went back home to get a load of supplies. Got delayed by a war. When he came back, the colony vanished. The missing colony of Roanoke. So, if you had money invested in that, you lost. Plenty of other cases where people invested and they lost. But people invested in Virginia, in the Virginia Company. I suspect that in the early years they were losing money. In time, it turns out to be profitable. So Parliament's view was just like, we're backing all this. The king grants you the charter. In some cases, the government is financially invested in this, but to a large degree, it's kind of a mix of government overseeing, getting involved in a free market. If you make money off of it, we, the government, are going to benefit from it. If you don't,
okay.
We just cut our
losses. And so what was probably somewhat surprising to them is that these colonies begin to revolt and rebel, which leads to the revolution, right? Was it how surprising was it, rather, to the Britons that the colonies would rebel?
Well, again, just like you had differences of opinions in the colonies, in Britain you had differences of opinion. Edmund Burke and others in Parliament were of the view that these people in the colonies are right. Their cause is just. There were others who would have typically viewed the colonists as ingrates. So, and you have this 13 years starting with the Stamp Act where Parliament passes a tax. The colonies don't like it. They boycott. They send protests. Parliament will step in and say, okay, we're going to back off this tax now. And then a little later, like, okay, now we're going to tax sugar. Colonists revolt. They boycott. And at one point, Parliament passes a law. They repealed a tax, but they passed a law along with it. I think it was the Declaratory Act, where it says, oh, by the way, this law says we can tax anything we want to. Now, we're going to repeal this particular tax, but if we want to, we can still tax you. It was a case of the colonies were trying, and I'll go to the case of John Calvin and Book 10 of the Institutes, where he says people can't rebel against the government directly, but the lesser magistrates can object to the government. And so the lesser magistrates were these colonial legislatures, these colonial actions leading to the First Continental Congress of them sending protests and saying, we object to this. We want a redress of grievances. We don't want to be taxed without representation. So it would not have surprised anybody when things happened in 1775, because this had been a hot spot now for a dozen years. Like we talk about the Boston Tea Party. that was one of about, I don't know how many similar events. They were just going on, after it was like, oh, did y'all hear about that? Let's try that here. So in every, in all the colonies, people were doing things against the colonial leaders. There were protests against colonial governors. There were boycotts. There were letters written. There were books, pamphlets. There were meetings. It was all kinds of things.
And so it seems like some of the earlier sentiments of dissatisfaction related fundamentally to religion, and it slowly began to morph into more than just religious autonomy.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yes.
And the colonies rebel, kickstart the revolution. The war goes on for how long?
From 1775 to 1783, 8 years.
Yeah, so well after the Declaration was signed. So they declared their independence, and now they're fighting for their independence for 7 more years.
Yes.
And how long was it until... So the war ends in 83. Do you know how long it takes for British troops to leave?
Well, the war was really, as far as serious fighting, was over in 1781 after Yorktown. That was, at that point, Britain was already trying to figure out, what do we do about this mess? They've got France now against them. They've got Spain. They've got Russia. They've got, even though Spain and Russia aren't major players in all this is a losing proposition for them. And so they lose an army at Yorktown, and they continued to have troops here, but there were not any major engagements after that. So, over the process of time, they're getting them out. By the time the peace treaty is signed, I don't know exactly how long, but it would have been relatively quick, that the amount of time where they got the last redcoat off American soil.
Yeah. The last couple of things I just want to talk about are, just real briefly, some of the dynamics of the war, and then lastly, just real broadly, the philosophy behind the Declaration. But first, so the war kicks off, and what are the major battles? How are they fought? How in the world can puny colonies, relative to Great Britain, fight off a massive professional military force?
Well, I'm glad you're, just throwing that out here at the end, where we can just close it. It's such a simple question that would only take about, 10 hours to even begin with. The problem that Britain had was that, and I just read a book on this recently, where the author said it was an unwinnable war because they were not in a position to occupy all of the territory. It was not like wars where you go in and you conquer territory from one end to the other. Supplying troops across the ocean, they did not have. It would have been an incredible cost for them to have subjugated the entire colonies. And part of the brilliance of George Washington and others was the case of playing a cat and mouse game, so that the British, what they would do is they would go and capture a major city. Boston early on, New York later, they march into Philadelphia, they capture Charleston, but capturing an American city is virtually a nothing in this war, because the army simply moves out and fights again. So that's why whenever you look at the number of skirmishes, if this war were just judged by some referees off to the side or scorekeepers, it was a British victory every which way. They won almost all of the all of the battles. Some of the others were ties, but it didn't matter. Even with the Americans winning, capturing a whole army at Saratoga, capturing a whole army at Yorktown, winning a big victory at Trenton, it still ends up being a case of The British capture a whole army at Charleston. The British capture, New York. The British are able to take almost anything they want to take. They can march through the countryside, part of it, but the enemy still exists, and they cannot tie it down. And in the nature of the case, the colonies, partially because Washington was just really good at training and developing troops. You had men who had trained. You had men who, he had been basically a British soldier in his earlier years. Part of his angst over the whole his whole life career was that he wanted to be a British officer, and they didn't. He wasn't allowed on in. So that would have changed history just a bit. But you had plenty of men who knew how the British Army was run. They knew how to train troops. We had mercenaries who came over and joined. Then at the point in time where you have the French come and join us, then we have, another professional army that comes in. So in a worst case scenario, it was not like...
Whoa, hold on. French. We just whooped them in the French-Indian War. Real briefly, why was it advantageous for the French? What was in it for the French to help the colonies out?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Did we give them any money or property or?
No.
Okay.
They got very little out of it, other than it unsettled France enough so that France ends up with a horrible revolution some years later.
Yeah.
It was not to their advantage overall, but there was a real strong element of payback.
Yeah.
And so they didn't get their colonies back or anything like that.
Okay.
So that's their part in it. But this is warfare at a time where this is not like men with sticks and stones going up against a modern day armor division. This was a case where American guns and firepower were on a par with British guns and firepower, except that Americans also had a lot of people who were sharpshooters, who had been hunters, who used those Kentucky long rifles, and they did something what was considered very unethical, and that is, let's aim for the guy on the horse who is the officer. And it was like, you weren't supposed to do that. And so their sharpshooters were taking out their officers. So they could, in a battle, even if they lost, they could fight pretty much on a par with the enemy.
That Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot.
Yes.
It always, I don't know, it always just seems to portray it so well, where the father has been training his kids how to use a rifle for hunting. Yeah. And now all these British troops come in, and he tells his boys, the way I've taught you, do the same.
Exactly.
And you get a similar picture in the 80s Red Dawn movie, where in that movie the Russians invade, and all the good old country boys with their deer rifles go to doing what they've always been doing during hunting season.
Well, that's why there's always been this kind of tradition that that Southern boys, country boys, and wherever they're living, whether it's in the South or they're guys living out in the West, or even if they're living in some place like Michigan, but they still go deer hunting, that's the heart of the American military, are those kind of guys who know how to do those kinds of things. But that was what enabled the American Army to, good leaders, as opposed to some incredible incompetence on the British part. Hardy soldiers, training. When the French come in, initially what they're doing is they're providing us weapons and ammunition and supplies, and they provided some naval support. So we were able to turn the tide on that.
Okay. Lastly, so there's a lot that we could, there's a lot we could still talk about, documents worth considering, but let's just consider the Declaration. Which Devin and I are going to speak to next week, I'm not super qualified to make any absolute judgments on it. I'm not a scholar of it, but I plan to address it philosophically. So the Declaration gets written. What is unique about the Declaration of Independence and what it stands for relative to the form of government and the philosophies undergirding Parliament in Britain? Like, what's different about it?
Well, the thing that I think throws people if they read it and they haven't read it a lot is that so much of it is this long list of specific complaints. And that's not the part that we memorize or we think about so much, but it's those opening words where what Jefferson was doing was he combined writing political philosophy, which he picked up almost word for word from John Locke, about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and have, and have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. And for whatever reason, he changed property to pursuit of happiness. And so he writes this opening as an appeal to everyone. Referring to God, and some people will come back and like, well, Jefferson actually was a deist, and here's what he believed about God. Jefferson was not writing a deistic document. He was writing good political writing that was going to appeal to everyone who would feel just a stirring passion about those kind of words.
So he was purposefully vague when he used the word God in particular?
I don't think vague. I think he was writing it in such a way that that the predominantly Christian people on both Americans, people living in Britain, people in France who would have been hearing about this, people around the world would have recognized like, we know what he's talking about.
Interesting. And verbiage that in the colonies that all denominations could embrace: Catholics, Presbyterians, yes, Baptists, Methodists.
This was a one-size-fits-all. This is an appeal to everybody. This is broadening the base, and it's giving this broad, moving, philosophical, here's why we're doing this. And whenever a government becomes oppressive, it is the right of people to do something about that. Well, the British had done that themselves. They had their own revolution just, about less than about a century or so before we had ours. Mm-hmm. So they were no strangers to, removing a king and changing the form of government. Other peoples had recognized that, what do you do if the government is oppressive and you've got to do something to change things? It's an old instinct that people have of there's more of us than there are of them, and they are imposing bad rules on us. So very stirring words, a very great thing, and then it gets into all these specifics that are directed, interestingly enough, not at Parliament, to the King. It's King George, mm-hmm. And it is the case of, all right, George, you're the guy in charge. You're the fella who should have been protecting your colonies, and you weren't. You're responsible.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Not sufficient, this conversation has been, but it's been satisfactory.
All right,
for
great.
for what we're going to be doing next week.
Great.
Not sufficient, meaning we haven't covered everything.
Right.
You haven't covered.
No.
Everything. I would kill. Well, I wouldn't kill. I would pay big money. I would pay money to sit underneath you in one of your classes. I'm frequently jealous of my own students because they're getting a great education, and I squandered many years away, and so.
Yeah, you should really have to go to school whenever you're a child and then go to work for about 20 years and then go back and retake the school classes.
Yes.
So that's why some of us teach, because it gives us a chance to retake the class.
Yes. Amen. Amen. Well, Ben, anything else you got?
That's it.
All right. Well, be on the lookout in the next coming months for our book, Beyond the Horizon, an appeal to parents for classical Christian education. And also look out next week for where Devin and I try to do our very best to understand the Declaration of Independence and also try to situate the conversation within our own nation's upcoming election here in a couple months. So stay tuned.
All right, Caroline.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.